What if the Exodus didn't need to be fully true to change everything? What if just one detail, one city, one name, one moment turned out to be real? Not miracles, not plagues, not seas splitting in half. Just one solid, undeniable detail. Because if even one part of the Exodus were historically confirmed, it wouldn't strengthen faith. It would detonate it. Tonight, we're not asking whether the Exodus happened. We're asking something far more dangerous. What would it mean if even one detail were true? And once you see it, you'll understand why historians don't argue about miracles first. They argue about absence. The strangest story ever treated as history. The Exodus is not a small claim. It is not a private vision whispered to a single prophet in a cave, not a dream recorded years later by someone trying to make sense of suffering. It is presented as something far louder than that, a public event, a national experience, a story meant to be remembered by everyone who lived through it and by every generation after. That alone should make us pause. This is not a quiet revelation. It is a nation on the move. Hundreds of thousands of people leaving together. Families, elders, children, animals, possessions. Decades spent wandering through open land. An empire humiliated in front of its enemies. An entire population removed from the landscape as if history itself hit reset. These are not the kinds of events that hide easily. They are not subtle. They are not ambiguous. This is why the scale matters so much. Folklore lives in the small spaces. It grows around campfires, inside households, between a few people at a time. But the Exodus is not built like folklore. It is built like an invasion, like a collapse, like a moment that should ripple outward into every neighboring culture and leave marks that last for centuries. When something this large happens, it bends trade routes, it disrupts politics, it forces other nations to react. And here is the first crack in the story. Events like this do not whisper. They shout. They leave scars in the ground, in records, in the memory of enemies who had every reason to remember them. Historians know this instinctively. When entire populations move or disappear, the evidence usually piles up. You do not have to look hard. You trip over it. But when historians go looking for the Exodus, they do not find scars. They do not find a trail. They do not find corroboration waiting to be uncovered. Instead, they find silence, not confusion. Not debate between competing records, just absence. And silence, in history, is never neutral. Silence means something failed to register, or something was never there to register at all. That is why the Exodus feels so strange when treated as literal history. Not because it is dramatic, but because it is dramatic without witnesses. A story this large should echo. The fact that it does not is not a small problem. It is the problem, if one campfire were real. Let's lower the bar, because the claim does not need miracles to survive. We can forget plagues raining down on Egypt. We can forget God speaking from the sky, or seas, parting on command. None of that is required to begin taking the story seriously as history. All that is needed is something far more ordinary, something almost boring. One campsite. Just one place where people clearly stopped and lived, even briefly. One fire pit where meals were cooked night after night. One burial ground where the dead were laid to rest. One broken pot half buried in the sand, dated to the right time, sitting exactly where the story says an enormous group once passed through. This is not an unreasonable request. Archaeology deals in fragments all the time. Entire civilizations have been reconstructed from less. Nomadic groups leave traces. Even when they move constantly, they still eat, bury their dead, repair tools, and discard what breaks. And armies leave far more than that. They leave layers. They leave waste, weapons, camps, paths worn into the land. The larger the group, the heavier the footprint. Scale always amplifies evidence. Now think about the claim itself. The Exodus does not describe a quick escape or a hurried migration. It claims 40 years of wandering. That is not a journey from one place to another. That is a civilization placed on pause. Generations growing up in the open, children born, elders dying, routines forming and repeating thousands of times. 40 years is long enough for patterns to settle into the land itself. If even one confirmed campsite existed, it would change everything. It would prove that a large group really was there. moving and stopping in ways that matched the narrative. And if the people were there, the story would no longer sit in the realm of mythology or theology. It would become catastrophic history. Something that forced us to rewrite what we think we know about the region, the period, and the cultures involved. But the desert gives us nothing. No trail of camps, no graves, no tools, not one. And that absence is not neutral. It creates tension that refuses to go away. Because at this scale, nothing should leave nothing. And that is where the story begins to feel less like a mystery waiting to be solved, and more like a question that was never meant to have an answer. Egypt, the empire that wrote everything down. Ancient Egypt was obsessed with record-keeping. This was not a casual culture that let events drift into legend without documentation. Egypt wrote things down because writing was power. It was administration, control, and memory, all at once. Victories were carved into stone. Defeats were explained, reframed, and still preserved. Famines were recorded. Political chaos was recorded. Even moments that made the state look weak were not entirely erased, because continuity mattered more than pride. They even tracked the Nile. Year after year, scribes documented when it rose too high or too low, because those changes affected food, stability, and survival. If the river sneezed, Egypt noticed. This level of detail tells us something important. Egypt was not forgetful. It was meticulous. Now imagine what the Exodus describes. An entire slave population escapes at once. Not a few families slipping away quietly, but a massive labor force vanishing. The economy collapses under the strain. Infrastructure breaks down. Fields go untilled. Projects stop. Then the army gives chase and is destroyed. Not defeated in a minor skirmish, but eliminated in a way that leaves the empire exposed and humiliated. That is not just history. That is national trauma. Empires do not simply move on from events like that. They reorganize, they mourn, they adapt, and above all, they record. Even if the story is spun, minimized, or reframed, something always remains. A hint, a complaint, a bureaucratic anomaly that points to disruption. So where is it? Not in monuments, not in inscriptions, not in administrative records tucked away on papyrus. There is no sudden gap that screams catastrophe, no economic shockwave that demands explanation, no reference to a mass disappearance that would have reshaped the entire labor system. And here is the strange part. Egypt does record defeats. It records times of instability, invasions, and internal collapse. It just does not record this one, which raises a brutal possibility. If the Exodus happened as described, it would be the most important event Egypt never noticed, and that absence is not easy to explain away. It sits there, heavy and unresolved, making historians uneasy for a reason, if even one name matched. Let's make it even easier, because history does not demand perfection. We can forget cities collapsing and armies drowning. We can forget mass migrations and supernatural drama. All we need is a name. One person, one identifiable figure that connects the story to the real world. History often survives through individuals long after events blur. Names endure when details fade. Ancient records are filled with them. Kings, generals, scribes, builders, priests, minor officials who only appear once and then vanish from the record. Egypt named everyone who mattered, and many who did not. Even people who fell out of favor were not always erased completely. They lingered as footnotes, corrections, or damaged inscriptions. Power struggles leave paper trails. Now consider Moses. According to the story, he was not a nobody. He was raised in the royal court, educated, positioned close to power. Then he became a criminal, a fugitive, and eventually the central figure in a national crisis. That is exactly the kind of person bureaucracies remember, either as an asset or as a problem. But Moses appears nowhere. There is no court figure that resembles him, no adopted prince whose story abruptly ends, no disgraced official quietly removed from records. Not even a fragment that hints at a troublesome individual who caused embarrassment and was pushed aside. The absence is complete. And this matters more than miracles. Miracles can always be debated away as exaggeration or symbolism. Names cannot. Legends almost always grow from real people. Myths stretch and decorate, but they usually stay anchored to someone who lived, someone whose existence is undeniable, even if the stories around them are not. Here, the anchor is missing. There is no historical shadow where Moses should be standing. That leads to a dangerous thought. What if Moses was not erased? What if there was no need to erase him at all? What if he was never there to begin with? And if that is true, the implications are far larger than one missing man. Because if the central figure is absent from history, we are forced to ask what else was built on that absence. How much authority, law, and identity can grow around a person who exists only in story? And once you ask that question, it becomes very hard to stop asking others. The law that had to come from somewhere. Now here is where it gets complicated, because the Exodus is not just a dramatic story about escape. It is a story that does something practical. It justifies a system. It explains why certain rules should be obeyed, why certain leaders should be followed, why a community should stay together even when it hurts. The Exodus is not only about where people went, it is about who gets to command them afterward. It is a justification for law, for authority, for obedience. You can hear it in the heartbeat of the narrative. We suffered. We were chosen. We were freed. That is not just memory, it is leverage. It turns hardship into moral credit, and it turns credit into control. Because once you believe you survived something sacred, commands stop feeling like suggestions. They start feeling like destiny. Rules become more than social agreements. They become a repayment, a loyalty test, a way to prove you belong. But think carefully about the question we started with. If even one detail of the Exodus were true, the laws attached to it would gain historical gravity. Not divine authority, but human consequence. They would become the kind of laws written in the aftermath of trauma, the kind that people cling to because chaos almost killed them. And laws born from trauma feel different. They do not just organize life, they protect identity. They demand loyalty, because loyalty is how a broken group stays unbroken. They create a shared story of who we are and who we must never become again. That is why those laws often come with rituals, boundaries, and warnings. Not because people enjoy restriction, but because restriction feels like safety when memory still burns. And that is the unsettling insight. Whether the Exodus is true or not, it functions like a founding myth, a narrative designed to produce cohesion, obedience, and meaning. Founding myths do not need evidence to work. They need belief. They need repetition. They need children to inherit the story before they inherit doubt. So the real question is, not only did it happen, the real question is what kind of society forms when its laws are chained to an escape story, and what happens when people realize the escape story might be the chain itself. Why the story had to be big. Small stories do not unify tribes for very long. They might explain a custom or a local rule, but they cannot bind generations together under pressure. Big stories do. Stories that feel larger than any one person. Stories that turn scattered groups into a single identity. The Exodus is built exactly like that kind of story. It offers a shared enemy, an outside force to blame for suffering and to fear in the future. It offers a shared escape, a moment when everyone moved together and survived together. And it offers a shared destiny, the promise that the pain was not random but purposeful. That combination is powerful. It does something ordinary history rarely does. It gives suffering meaning. The Exodus explains why people suffered, why they survived, and why they are different from those around them. Difference quietly becomes superiority, not always in arrogance, but in reassurance. We are not like them because we were tested. We endured. We were chosen. This is not just theology, it is psychology. And here is the contradiction that makes historians uneasy. The more powerful a story is at shaping identity, the less likely it needed to be true in the literal sense, because its real job was never to record events. Its job was to hold people together, to stabilize a fragile community surrounded by stronger forces, to create an us that could survive a hostile world. Meaning did not come from facts. Facts came after meaning. Once the story existed, details could be filled in, sharpened, repeated, and sanctified. Over time, belief hardened. Doubt became dangerous. Questioning the story started to feel like threatening the group itself. And once belief sets in, evidence becomes optional. Not because people are stupid, but because belief solves problems that evidence cannot. It answers who we are, why we matter, and why obedience feels necessary. That is why big stories endure, even when small facts fall away. They are not remembered because they are true. They are remembered because they are useful, the detail that would change everything. So let's return to the question, because it has been quietly waiting beneath everything else. What if even one detail were true? Not the whole story, not the miracles, just one solid point of contact with reality. One campsite, one name, one record that refuses to be explained away. It would not prove God. It would not suddenly validate divine intervention or settle theological debates. What it would do is far more unsettling than that. It would show how belief can move faster than evidence, and how stories can solidify into reality after people have already committed to them. Because if a single detail were confirmed, it would not stand alone. It would retroactively pull the rest of the story closer, not because it was proven, but because humans are wired to complete patterns. One verified fragment would feel like permission to believe the whole. The myth would not just survive, it would harden. And that would reveal something uncomfortable about us. That identity can come before evidence. That people do not follow truth first. They follow stories that make them feel chosen, protected, and meaningful. Truth, when it arrives later, is often forced to adapt to the story, not the other way around. This is why the absence matters so much. Not because it destroys faith, but because it exposes the process. It shows how narratives gain authority without needing confirmation, how repetition becomes reality, how belief turns into inheritance. And once you see this pattern, you start seeing it everywhere. In nations, in ideologies, in movements that swear they are built on facts but behave like myths. Stories that explain suffering, promise, destiny, and demand loyalty all follow the same structure. The Exodus is not unique in that sense. It is simply one of the clearest examples. The most unsettling possibility is not that nothing happened. It is that belief alone was enough to build a world. And if belief can do that here, it can do it anywhere. The Exodus doesn't survive on evidence. It survives on need. The need to explain suffering, the need to feel guided, the need to believe history has a purpose. And that's the real revelation. If even one detail were true, it wouldn't confirm the miracle. It would expose the machinery of belief. How stories become sacred, how memory becomes law, how meaning outruns truth. And maybe that's the hardest part to accept. Not that the Exodus might be false, but that humans don't need it to be true for it to shape the world. So keep questioning, not because belief is stupid, but because belief is powerful. And if you value truth over comfort, stay curious, subscribe, and don't stop thinking.